with lots of people in the room, there might be lots of questions later as well. So presentation, integrating Project Server and SharePoint 2010. Potentially a bit of a strange topic maybe, because Project Server is built on top of SharePoint 2010. Surely they're integrated already, yeah? I'm presuming, since most of you have implementations, or at least you're going through that kind of thing, you probably have the same issues that I've had. A few nods around there as well. So the premise of this presentation is that I used to be a SharePoint-only consultant, started in 2004, working in SharePoint 2003. And then about 4 years ago, I transitioned into a company who did a lot around Project Server. They've been doing Project Server since the days of 2000, and they knew a lot about stuff, and they wanted to expand their SharePoint business, and that's why I came in. Now, obviously, being in a company that's so Project Server-centric, I have learned quite a lot about Project Server in the last 4 years that I've worked there. And I made quite a few gotchas, because if you're experienced in SharePoint and then you move into a Project Server world as well, things break really easily, right? So, a few laughing there and that kind of stuff. And if you are laughing, then you hopefully know the pain, but it can be resolved and it can be sorted out, as long as you know where the pain points are. So, with the introduction of Project Server 2010, it's now built on top of the enterprise version of SharePoint. And you could do this in 2007, but it was not kind of the default. Now you have all these extra options, and I'm just going to go through that, some standard deployment approaches that us as a consultancy do. I'm going to go through kind of making the most of those enterprise features, BI, forms, stuff like that. And then a section I call Breaking the Rules, which is really talking about where things break. So, hopefully, if you've seen the agenda on the website, you'll have seen some words to that effect. And that is essentially, I'm going to talk about how SharePoint and Project Server kind of work together, semi-high level. I'm going to talk about the enterprise features, as I just said, and then really talk about kind of the issues, and then hopefully on a more positive note, talk about what we can do about it, what to avoid, and that will come out of the deployment approaches as well. So a bit more about me. I started doing SharePoint 2004. I used to work for Microsoft Business Solutions in the UK, where I was actually implementing kind of, well, it was BI solutions, but not in a SharePoint way, because 2003 didn't really have BI features. But I stayed there for a year or so. I then went out into education, did an educational solution, VLEs, that kind of thing. Then I moved into CPS, which is the company I work for at the moment. Got more into Project Server, as I said earlier. We predominantly do the orange area there in the UK. We're based in Marlow, which is just outside of London, if you don't know. But we also cover the whole of Europe with some partners. So Compania and Schott do kind of Germany, France, etc. And then we have a joint venture called CXS that handle the Netherlands, Benelux, that kind of area. And then if you want to find out more about me, what I do, some community efforts I do, I run a blog, ghamson.wordpress.com. You can get hold of me on LinkedIn. I've got some Coplex projects. And I write mobile apps for fun, because I'm a bit strange. Just a bit about the agenda. Again, we're going to go through some brief history just so we can get some context. Deployment approaches. There are 3 main deployment approaches I'm going to talk about. Again, integration and consistency, enterprise features, all the features there. And then the breaking the rules part, which is some of you were laughing about that, then hopefully that will ring true. And then we'll take some questions as well. If you have questions in between time, the deck's quite large, but please raise your hand and we can go through it. If I have to stop asking questions, I'll be around at the end as well. So, let's talk a little bit about the history. I'm not going to run through every single one of these things, because that would be really boring, right? Project and Microsoft synonymous from the beginning. So they have been doing project management tools since 1984 in MS-DOS, right? And then they've moved it into Windows. There were Mac versions for a little while, but they've gone away. And then in 2000, they started doing what we know and hopefully love today, centralized resourcing, centralized planning, originally called Project Central. 2002, they introduced SharePoint for your soft data, documents, risks, issues, that, etc. And then, if you think about it more in kind of a triangle, we kind of have SharePoint and Project Server as separate systems, kind of loosely based together, and then with each version, they've got closer and closer. And hopefully, for most of you who are using the 2010 version, you'll see that a lot of the BI features of old have gone away, and they've started to use standard SharePoint BI. So all those lovely stuff like the data access components and things like that we used to love, and the pivot tables that we could do on the web, they suddenly went away. And then you're left with Excel services, which is actually a lot more powerful, but if you're used to the old way of things, it was quite a learning curve, right? So that really leaves the ultimate question that I'd like to ask you guys out here. Are SharePoint and Project Server really integrated? Any thoughts, anyone? What do you mean by sort of or kind of?
Well, within the project web app, for instance, you've got different project workspaces.
Yep.
People are familiar with SharePoint for document repositories, workflows, things like that. Will be comfortable. Will be comfortable with creating document libraries, tasks, things like that. But then there's kind of some overlap, especially for things like task features and accounting features.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have those integrations set up properly.
Yes.
So they're kind of integrated, but it's kind of integrated schizophrenically if you look at it.
That's correct.
Clear vision for how you're going to.
Cool. For those in the back who didn't hear that, he's totally right. So because they were two separate products that have been brought together slowly, and with every version they're getting better and better, there are certain key things that are just slightly different, right? So in your team workspaces, there are integration features that work directly with the project client. It links into tasks, but now, obviously, Project Server, you've got this idea of two notions of tasks. You've got workflow tasks, you've got Project Server tasks, but the naming is the same, and it's just a bit weird. So we're going to go over some deployment approaches, of which I split them into three. The first one being the out-of-the-box Project Web App. So in SharePoint and Project Server 2010, you have standard root site collection. You have a separate site collection called the Project Web App, and then you have project sites that typically, on a default install, go underneath that. You're not obviously going to go wrong without the box installation, depending on obviously what your requirements are, but there's some deep integration there with the client. You can connect into your risks, your issues, your documents. You can have deliverables that look in SharePoint that also appear in the project client. And you can update them between two. But there are some problems with this approach, yeah? So they're using standard SharePoint kind of functionality, and if you've been using SharePoint for a while, then SharePoint sites are generally quite siloed, unless you kind of pre-plan up front with something they call content types and things like that. So if you look at the pros and cons of this kind of scenario, you have this nice integration. Team sites are created automatically when you create a plan. So if you're a project manager, you're living in that project management world, and you're in your project client. You create your plan, you save it. Do you want to create a site for this? Yes. It creates that site for you as well. And there are nice links in there, and it sorts out the security based on who's attached to your plan. It's all really cool. But if you're quite mature in your project management processes, because this is really good in a kind of, I'm just starting out, I know that I need to do kind of centralized resourcing, I need to do centralized planning, but generally I run projects and they're separate to each other. That's good, but at some point, probably fairly quickly, you're going to want to not just run projects siloed, like they are in this case. you're going to want to actually run a program of projects. You're going to want to say, for example, there's a presentation going on at the moment for ARM, which is my client as well. Oops. And for example, they create the chips unofficially for the iPad, for example. The A5X chips in the new iPad, from their point of view, that is a program, or a development as they call it. Separate projects are spawned off from that for support, maintenance, documentation, the graphics chip, the processing chip. But they're all dependent on each other. Yeah? You can't do support until things are kind of done. You can't do the documentation until things are almost done. The graphics chip probably has dependencies on the kind of core processor. So having separate projects for each one of those things, because it's still quite a large division, different types of resources do that kind of work. You can't, having it all in one plan doesn't really make sense, because project managers have different skill sets for their different kind of roles, and I'm sure that's true of your organizations as well. You could do master and sub-plans, but we can go into that later. If you want to roll out your risks across the board, because really they're developing a product for a customer, you can't do it in this out-of-the-box scenario very easily. The customizations they provide, they're not using kind of the standard features of site content types, so you can't roll it up using the standard BI tools that you get in SharePoint. So you've effectively got siloed sites. What do you do about that? And then, to make matters kind of worse, they put some restrictions on PWA as well. So you could get over this. Risk lists are created. You could create something they call site content types, so you have this common content type that defines a risk across your whole site. And then you could attach that to all your project sites, and then you would have the ability to do all that. And you might want to do a workflow that goes between risks and issues. It's a very common thing for escalation and approval. But you can't connect SharePoint Designer to the project web app. Which means that if you want to do kind of workflows, you have to code it. And I thought I was implementing a project management system. Why have I got to get a developer involved in this kind of thing when I can do it in SharePoint out of the box? So now I was surprised when I started to come to this. Totally threw me for a loop. Still can't really understand it now, to be honest, but I've been told good reasons. So we can do something about that. And that would be, let's place the project sites in a standard SharePoint site collection. This is totally supported out the box. In fact, when you create Project Web App, one of the first things it does is ask you, where do you want to put those sites? And by default, it will be where it's going to create PWA. And if you've already done that now, and you're using out-of-the-box configurations at the moment, you can go into server settings and you can change where your future projects and project sites will be deployed. And then you could actually migrate your other ones and change the links as well. So now that it's attached to the SharePoint root site collection, and again, no coding required, definitely supported out of the box. If we look at the pros and cons again, you still have those integration features. Like I said, it's a supported method to do. You still have all the kind of features that you normally get, and there's no change. But you have more flexibility now. So you can do workflows. You can use SharePoint Designer. And because you can use SharePoint Designer, unlike the previous one, you can actually use it to change the master page and the style of at least the SharePoint site collection to match your corporate style guides, those things that are important to various people around the organization. But you can also extend it a bit further. You need to be a bit careful when you do extend it, and that is that you can use the method I was talking about a little while ago. So you could use site content types to define a risk, and you could actually change that to move away from the standard way that Microsoft do it at the moment, which is actually just a list content type and it's still siloed. Now the benefit that you get from using a site content type, and for those of you who have used SharePoint in the room, hopefully this is ringing true, you can define one content type to define what a risk means. And those columns will be attached to that content type, and they will be the same for all sites that that content type is attached to. So the problem in the first version, of course, is that if you wanted to add a column, you had to add it separately to each one. Hopefully this is really ringing true. It becomes quite painful. If you're doing exports so you can do reporting in Excel and things like that, all the data is slightly mismatched. Now you can start to keep things standard, and you can also start to control that by making those content types read-only so that you have a single forum so that you can then add a column that everyone is aware of and everyone's communicated, and you can handle the business side of these changes. And if you start using those site content types, you can then use the standard features of SharePoint to do roll-ups of that data. So one of the biggest things of having things siloed is that, and they're all list content types, of course, is that you can't roll these things up. So for my A5X chip, what are my main risks across all the projects? As a program manager, I want to see that kind of thing, and I don't want to see 3 separate reports that actually report 90% of the same data, but this report over here has 10%, which is really important to them, but means nothing over here. I'm not comparing apples with apples anymore. This allows you to go down that approach. But there's a problem with doing that as well. So if you do that, then the integration features start to break. So you saw, hopefully, in the keynote this morning, when they're doing their demo, they go into the backstage, and you can click on risks, and that will take you to their project site, all that side of things. Now, the project site link would still work. The risk list would still work to a degree, but there are certain features in PWA that would start to break because it relies on those key integration features that they've added in and those particular fields they've added in. So if you rename those fields, even if you don't go down this site content type route, it starts to get a bit crazy, but even if you rename the standard fields out the box, suddenly the roll-up of the risks and issues that you get in the project web access start to break. Those standard columns that you get just sometimes aren't descriptive enough, yeah? And you have to present the data in a way that you're used to. And if you've moved into a project server world, then you're clearly semi-mature in terms of the way you're doing your project management, and you probably have these processes mapped out on how you record a risk. You might have started with RAID matrices or something like that in a spreadsheet, define columns that mean something to your management. So the site content type route actually sounds like a really good idea because you can actually define the columns that you want. You'll be able to roll that up how you want and create the reports that you need. Again, using the standard web parts out of the box. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So the third approach, and a more radical approach, again, still supported, because the other approach that I described, as much as I've said is a bit extreme at times, it is still supported. It's still standard SharePoint out the box, and if you're happy to lose those integration features, then it doesn't matter. It will still upgrade, it will still go through the service packs, it will still go through the cumulative updates. They're not going to chuck you out of Microsoft support, all that kind of stuff. And the same is true of this method as well. But part of the reason for this presentation is to try and get the best out of the enterprise features and the standard features that you get in SharePoint. And hopefully this approach that I'm about to describe details that. So we talked about separate project sites. And we've talked about the problem with those project sites. The siloed data, we can do something about that. If you have something with site content types, that allows you to roll up the data based on certain web parts that are out of the box, like something called the content query web part. Don't know if you've ever used the content query web part. Have you ever tried it? Anybody? Raise their hand. Was it fun? You must be a developer, sir. So, it's not very out of the box. So you can put it on a page, and you can point it to the site content type that you created, and you can roll up all your risks, and you will definitely see the title of all those risks across the whole of your site, or how you spit it out based on your query. So that would definitely work. Of course, having the title of all your risks with no notion of what project or program they're associated with doesn't really help you. And the content query web part, you can change it. If you know XML and you know XLT and you have a good understanding of SharePoint, you can change it and you can make it look and you make it sing and dance however you wish, because it's actually a really extendable web part. And for technical people like myself, it actually doesn't take too long either. You know, it's a few hours here, maybe a day there. You spend more time with your customer trying to work out what they want than you do with configuring that web part. Which is really why you do the Microsoft solutions, yeah? Because it's providing you a platform for facilities to really make these things as easy as possible, but also as flexible as possible. But that is one of the main web parts that you would use in the option 2 scenario. But what if you want to do something more graphical? What if you want to provide more control to your end users, like you have in kind of the standard SharePoint sites with views, personal views, but you want to control it so that it's the same across the board? And because we've talked about siloed sites and they're created based on project plans, if you want to change that site, you're 3 months or you're 6 months into your implementation, and you become more mature, you want to add certain things to those sites, you can't add them to the past very easily unless you know code, or you go and manually enter them in for every single project. And if you're 50 projects deep, before you decide to change how you're going to go with the future, that doesn't help. So this solution hopefully gets over that with some caveats. So I've implemented this a number of times. Some awards have been won in 2009, when we first did this in 2007 as well. It's a recognized approach by CPS, obviously my company, UMT, very, very big in the States, I believe. And essentially what we're saying here is that you do not actually have project sites. Just a bit more radical. You actually have centralized lists for all your soft metadata. Now, obviously, concentration purely on the SharePoint side of things, and that is because the assumption in here is, on part of this presentation, is that we're talking more about the SharePoint Enterprise features. The project features, in terms of resourcing and planning, has not changed. You still get Project Center, you still get the centralized resourcing, you still get those reports. But the soft metadata, like the risks, if you have a centralized risk list, and we're talking more about kind of database theory here, if you wanted in a database to have a big list of data and you wanted to associate it and cut it and slice it in many ways, you would add a column called project, and you would put the project code in there or the project name. You might put the program against it as well, and maybe the division that you're attached to. Which means that in SQL, you could query it by the division, and you'd get all the division risks, or you'd get all the program risks, or you'd get the ones particular to the project, depending on your work laws. So if we put that into a SharePoint environment, if we have a centralized list for risks in this scenario, we can have extra metadata against every single risk for project, program, and division. And we can start to use some of the enterprise features that you get with SharePoint 2010 as standard, because, of course, Microsoft ensure that you have the enterprise version before you even start a project server, right? So you now have the BCS with you, and you can actually attach that directly to your project server reporting database. And you can actually attach the codes and the project details that you'd have, like the title of the project, against everything that you do. And of course, the project managers might put programs against it. I'll come to you in a sec. Against their project plans, and you can bring that in as well with the BCS. And you can do the same with the division. Sorry, you had a question.
How do you secure the permissions?
We'll come to that in a sec. It's an excellent question. That's one of my caveats, in fact. So, You can use the BCS to bring all this stuff in. We'll talk about more in kind of what you can do in terms of other enterprise features as well. But as this gentleman here quite rightly said, there are some caveats to this. But before I go into that, to make that truly work, you want to stop project sites from being created. That's a setting in PWA. And as you'll see as we go down this approach, for nice consistency and integration to make it a nice user experience to end users, if you go down this approach, it is going to require a lot more development. You will need a developer. But you might get more of the result that you want at the end. So if we look at the pros and cons of this. So the cons will come in a sec. So the pros are that we can now start to use standard list views and standard list filters to filter your data, not just by project, like you could do in versions 1 and 2 of the approaches, but you could also do it by program and division. Really powerful stuff, and is available to our end users. You can use the standard features of SharePoint Enterprise, like the query string web part. So you can pass parameters into the URL string, and then you can filter that list dynamically based on links. This gent's nodding, clearly has an idea of what I'm going on about. Excellent. And then you can use things like the chart web part, which is a lovely new feature they added in 2010, standard edition and up. And you can then map your you can graph and you can do pie charts of your risks based on project, based on program, based on division. And suddenly we can start to create dashboards that resemble highlight reports that you can start reporting to your management, who really wanted you to implement these kind of solutions so that they can get kind of true data and compare apples and apples across your divisions. You can make changes easily to your dashboards, and it will be reflected across the board. So you add a column to a list, and it will be on every single project. You can add new dashboard pages and different views. You could use audience scene in your menu systems so that the IT team see a certain view, the HR team see a different view, but they're still using the same schema underneath. So it's still apples with apples, and you can still do your cross-divisional reporting, cross-program reporting, etc. There are some heavy cons, though, as this gent definitely alluded to. Obviously, the integration features entirely break. You won't be able to use risk and issues in PWA. It won't roll up any of that stuff at all. The security model is completely different. And in clients where we have implemented this, they have more of a trust basis that people can see all project data. They still have this idea of team members, readers, so only certain people can edit, certain people can read, and then certain people can change things. But they tend to have more kind of high-end system admins to do key changes to their dashboards. So it's now forcing you to have more skilled-up resources to make changes to your system as well. And you lose other kind of key functionality that you might expect from Project Server out of the box. In versions 1 and 2 of our deployment approaches, if you did an alert or a personal view, it would be based on that project and that project alone. Of course, in this scenario of a centralized list, if you get an alert when someone's added something to the risk list, you're actually getting an alert on any of those projects that anyone has created, which is horrible. Really, really horrible. You can kind of solve the permission problem with SharePoint Designer, and now that we're using this approach and it's in the SharePoint site collection, we can connect that in. Thank God in SharePoint Designer you can actually change the permissions of things, and you have this idea of item level permissioning across your lists. As something is created, you could, in your SharePoint Designer workflow, as it's created and edited, you could go off to a list, find out who the project manager is, and find out maybe an AD group is, and then you could permission the item individually, which gives you at least a level of control of who can see what soft data. But of course, we're now talking about a completely different permission model to Project Server. So you're now maintaining two permission models. So there's some heavy gains. You get some real problems that you've got to sort out. But if you sort out those problems with the local friendly developer that you've just hired, you can get over all of these problems. So we've created solutions at CPS for a number of clients where we've been able to do custom alerts. So we stop the standard alerts system happening on that thing, we override what's going on, and we bring up a different form that says, what do you want to do? Do you want to see all the risks? Do you want to see it by program? Do you want to see it by project? You can want to see it by division. And then we hook back into the standard email system of SharePoint. So you're using SharePoint like the platform it's, at least in some people's minds, it's intended to be. And you're just kind of changing the front end and passing some parameters in before they do it. You can do the same with personal views. The way this works with your dashboards is that you're using kind of standard filter web parts out of the box. So as you can hook into when views are created, and as a developer, you can then put the web part that does the filtering on out the box. You can then have that connected as well, so that when someone creates a view, all those kind of standard things that you've done to create those dashboards are done out the box. And we talked about permissions as well. This approach, we don't do this all the time. Tends to be larger customers, customers who have a very specific project management process that they need to follow, especially around their soft data that I'm calling risks and issues. But when it comes to actually defining the really detailed requirements about what they want their dashboards to look like, they just find it really hard. Because they want to see it and they want to feel it, and then they want to change it on the fly. Because all that stuff in SharePoint really allows you to do that, and unfortunately the way they silo things off in options 1 and 2 makes that really hard, that if you've made a decision at one point, 3 or 6 months down the line, and you want to make a different choice, either the people who are running 3-year projects who worked in one way have to live that way till the end, and then they'll get the new features 3 years when they're done. Or you have to develop stuff to add the things that you want to do, so you still need that developer. Or you could go this approach where you add it in and it's available to everybody. And SharePoint's quite nice around the data that if something is required, so you've got this new field and you add a new required field in there, anything that's old in there, the data is blank. But then if you want to go and edit that, so that obviously with closed projects and things as well, it'll only force you to put that data in if you try to amend that data. So you're enforcing that model down the line. So yeah, so we've done this several times. We have used it internally as well. Go.
In option 2,
yeah?
when you're installing, you're actually setting this up the first time, can you actually specify a specific content type for risks and issues?
You cannot, no. So in option 2, you would have to create the standard site yourself, and then you would either have to manually attach that site content type after the project site's created, or you would do something called what they call a feature staple, so that when the project site's created, it actually takes the standard content type that's created with the integration features out, put your new one in before it started. Okay? Typically, when people have gone down this approach, they have more of a kind of an admin that kind of does that kind of thing when they create a project. It's part of their project creation process, because spending money on a developer to do that kind of thing just seems like a lot of money for no reason. Any questions about the option 3 approach? Yes?
How does this change the licensing model?
That's a good question. So, obviously, it depends on whether they're accessing PWA, yeah? So in this model, They're not really using Project Web Access at all, but you probably do want them to see Project Web Access in some form or another. So in my experience, it doesn't really change the licensing model at all. Those project managers who still need to see things like Project Center and things like that still need to have their PWA licenses. The project managers will still need to have their Project Professional Client licenses. And, of course, you still need your SharePoint Standard and SharePoint Enterprise cows as well. Hopefully that answers the question. Yes, sir?
How does this approach handle project-related document storage?
What a perfect question. So, could you be a bit more defined in what you mean by that?
Well, standard approach with separate project sites.
Yeah?
Documents are in that project site for that specific project.
Yes.
If you don't have project sites, you've got one giant document library, basically, right?
That's correct.
Is it controlled by views, audiences, something that way?
So because libraries and lists work the same way in terms of your views, you can still do your filters in the same way. You could still do the permissions side of things as well using a workflow. In terms of scalability, which might be in your minds as well as this as well, with the introduction of 2010, in your lists and your libraries, the tests that they put in their planning capacity, 30 million items in each of your things, and we'll talk about capacity planning later. And, well, yeah, it filters out. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay. It can get bogged down. You do need to be aware of view thresholds, things like that. If you do something like, I'll come to you in a sec, if you do something like show me all projects in all things, then you will hit limits of view thresholds that maybe only an admin can get hold of. But you control that by filters. Yes?
What about when you want to migrate to the next version?
That's a good question as well. So, the centralized list approach and content types approach that I'm talking about is standard SharePoint configuration. Obviously, I can't guarantee it will upgrade, but you aren't doing anything that is out of the norm. The custom code that you do, as long as you follow the best practices in the SDK, you should be okay. Obviously, there's no guarantees, but yeah. But everything we've talked about generally at the moment is we're talking about SharePoint Designer workflows, we're talking about site content types, and we're talking about standard web parts that you put on a page. You'd probably typically use a publishing page maybe in the publishing features, so you can get your styles and you can get your different page layouts and things like that. But all of this stuff is still fairly standard out of the box. And when I say it breaks the features of Project Web Access, no irreparable harm is happening. It's just it can't access the data it's expecting, so therefore it shows nothing. Does that answer your question? So, to just give you a summary of all that, let's check my timing here. Okay. Let's talk about that in a business context. So, everything's about the maturity of your client, the maturity in terms of project management, the maturity of technology. So, if they have just started down the route of using SharePoint and Project Server, you wouldn't go down the option-free route. Even if all the stuff I've talked about, which is about dynamic dashboards and all that kind of stuff, is really what you're looking for. Because there's a learning curve that you've got to get to before you go down that approach. Otherwise, it'll be very painful. So if you go down the out-of-the-box approach, you can quite easily, you still have your siloed site, but at some point you could then transition, once you're used to using kind of your centralized resourcing, your centralized planning, you're used to kind of SharePoint, you've kind of trained up your users about how uploading documents work, how risks work, etc. You can transition into the number 2, where you can start customizing the look and feel, you can start to have more standardized risks and issues, that kind of thing. You can transition that by changing the settings, and then at least your future projects will go down that route. But at least you've now got buy-in from your end users, you've got buy-in from your project managers and buy-in from your management. And hopefully this presentation will allow you to set expectation. So you can say, we're going to go down this route. It means that the projects that we run down this route will generally stay in that configuration. And then once we've kind of moved down this next route, we can move forward. You could, as a starting point, at least go into the option 2 scenario, but don't do your site content types. So at least everything is all under one umbrella. And then you could add the site content types later. And you could do that as your maturity grows with the product set. And if you definitely need to change the custom look and feel, maybe it needs to integrate into your intranet or something like that, something that's very key, it's a SharePoint technology, right? Then option 2, pointing it there, that at least gives you more options. It's still supportable and it's very easy. If you're in the more particular scenario where you have a certain process that you have to follow, those dashboards are really key because a lot of these kind of things, you can do dashboards at the box on a per project basis. The rolling up is a pain, as I've said. If you need to do that roll up, because maybe you're coming from another system or something like that that you're used to, you've already got management reports that you need to implement, but maybe you need to improve it because, for whatever reason, then you could go down that option 3 route, or you could go down the option 2 route and do more customization to roll things up. And we'll talk about some of the customizations you can do to make option 2 a bit more usable like option 3 later. Any other questions at all? Yes?
I think you mentioned earlier that some of the roll-up reporting could be done in option 1 or 2 if you used a cube. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, sorry. I missed that point. So, the analysis services cube that comes out of the box does hook into those sites that you create out of the box with Project Server, but it is configured to look at those standard fields. And if those standard fields don't match what you need to do to meet your requirement, it won't bring through any custom fields unless you extend that cube yourself. And if you know anything about kind of SharePoint development, they don't actually allow you to go into the content database anyway from a supportable point of view, which makes things very hard. Which is really where kind of approach 3 is born out of. So, thank you. Good question. Anyone else? Yes?
Well, if it does bring over the custom project fields, so are you talking about the custom task fields that it doesn't bring over?
No, I'm talking. So we're purely talking about kind of SharePoint data. So we're talking about risks,
Right.
issues, lists. You're right. It does bring through your custom task fields, your project level fields, and your resource level fields, and you can configure the cube accordingly for your project data. But when it comes to the SharePoint data, you can't configure the cube to bring through the risk data and things like that.
Okay. Then I have a new question.
Go on.
Can you comment on the functionality that allows you to have your project sites as subsites of one another? You know, like if you're setting up a program and you've got multiple projects and you want those subsites,
Yep.
can you comment on any pros and cons and why you would or would not use that?
So the same rules kind of apply in each scenario, yeah? So obviously it doesn't apply to scenario 3 because we're handling that in a different way. Because if you use the option 1 scenario, everything's under the project web access things. You can, if you want, use site content types, but then you can't start adding workflows to it because you can't connect SharePoint Designer to it, then you have to use code. But you could still do that kind of standardized approach. And the same rules apply for number 2, essentially. So you could have sites underneath sites. If you put the content types at the top level, they will be available anywhere in the tree. Yeah. Last one. Yeah.
So does Microsoft support this if you do this?
Which one?
Any of them?
Well, obviously, support number 1, because that's out of the box.
Well, if we do 3, does Microsoft support us if we want to?
Okay, good question. So they will support 2, because obviously we haven't added any code. it depends on your support question though, right? So they're not going to turn you away. If you complain to them that the roll-up of risks and issues in PWA doesn't work because you have taken away their standard functionality, they'll turn around and tell you it's because you've taken away their standard functionality. They will support your platform. It will be upgradable. They won't support that web part if you've taken their feet from under them. Does that make sense? So you're not breaking your support relationship, is the key thing. You're not going in and you're not changing the world. And if you really wanted to, you could go back to that approach with no problem. So, yeah. So I've kind of set the scene about how you can do things. Let's start talking about some of these kind of integration options that really allow you to get the benefit of Project Server. So Project Server is, as we have discussed, it's kind of separate to SharePoint. It's kind of not. And there are some extra APIs that developers can hook into to automate certain things. So there's a PSI interface, like the web service that you get in SharePoint, like list.asmx, etc. You can hook into projects, resource, timesheets. You could create projects via code. You can create resources via code. You can create and fill in timesheets via code as well, including the approval of that. And some of the customizations that we do for clients is maybe that they have a timesheet system that's already in place in Oracle or something like that, Oracle Financials or something like that. But they still want the data in Project Server because that's how they handle their costs and their actuals. Maybe they're in single entry mode or something like that. So you can code an interface between the two. There are some partners that help you to do that, or we can custom code it. So it's not out the box. But hopefully the reason why you choose Microsoft products is that they have this extensibility so you can actually meet your business requirement because they have all the APIs for you to change these things as well. With some caveats though, right? Not everything that Project Server can do magically, you can do via code. And one of the main things that we get from our customers is that we can't actually implement baselines via an external route. It's been true in all the versions, and it hasn't changed across the board. You can do some things around that, so if you're clever with the project client and customization, I wouldn't try and automate the project client behind the scenes. That's a very painful approach, and certainly not a supported approach. But you can add VBA to your project client to provide things like a notification. So you could do something like access the PSI, add maybe a flag into your project information level field that says, I want to baseline this plan now. And then when someone opens up the plan again, there's a bit of VBA that runs that says, is this flag set to 1? Oh, it is. Cool. I want to baseline 0. And it will do that automatically in the background, or maybe you do a pop-up saying, would you like to baseline your plan? You don't want to upset your project managers first. So you might want to put a pop-up say, do you want to baseline your plan? No, I want to sort out my plan before you baseline it. And then you could put a stop before they publish and save it so that it forces them to baseline so you can perhaps go through the next stage gate in your project process. There are some other key kind of customizations. With 2010, they introduced Project Server workflows, especially around portfolio management. They didn't provide an interface, unfortunately. They basically provide an API. There is a basic interface, so you can add fields and you can do certain things, but if you want to do something really clever, you do have to code it, unless you use one of these solutions. So Nintex have created something called, I can't remember what it's called now. Nintex Workflow for Project Server. And they've just actually announced in this section version 2 of it as well. UMT also do a project as well as part of their project financials, which I'm sure if you go to their stand, they'll be able to talk to you about as well. So if we talk about kind of examples of that, let's talk about the resource PSI. So a key thing that we do as a company is that HR actually manages their resources. You know, new starters come in, they handle all the kind of contracts, how much they get paid, and then even they probably get to enter in their cost rates and things like that, yeah? But HR don't manage your project server system. So a common thing is that they might have SAP or Dynamics in the Microsoft world to store that data in. You can use the resource PSI, and you can create a bit of code to go through some logic. We have a resource sink that we do that from. And then you can do some logic to then import that into Project Server. So as soon as you have a new starter, they are available to be resourced as soon as HR know about it. Typically that's done on a daily job or something like that, and it's done overnight. So the next day, as soon as someone HR knows about that, they will be in there. And you can do just resources, or you can also do cost rates as well. Effective to, effective from dates. So resources obviously change costs over time. You don't want to change your old project costs because you've upped the cost of your resources because of inflation or whatever. Maybe they're more upskilled and they're worth more money. So you can do that all via the PSI as well, so that you can have all your old plans cost in the same way. New plans will work on a new rate, because it's all based on the task timelines as well. Before I go into the next bit, any questions about that? Cool. Other things they've done, and thank God, I have to say, in 2007, a lot of the timesheet controls and everything else were all done using ActiveX controls, and they've taken those ActiveX controls away, for the most part. There's a new timesheet data entry system in Project Server 2010. And they've also implemented something called single entry mode. That means you can progress your actuals via timesheeting and task updates. Something that kind of was there in 2003, kind of went away, and it kind of came back again in a slightly better way. And one of the examples that we've had as a client recently is that Project Server allows you to say the contracted hours of my users are definitely between 4 hours because they're part-time, one half day a week, and 60 hours for HiExec. But you can't say on a per resource basis, Susie works 12 hours a week, Giles is 40 hours a week, etc. But it's quite a common requirement, because you might want to do something like, I don't know, you want to capture definitely they've done their contracted hours. And it's not about the Big Brother stuff, it's really just about pure project costing. And you want to know what their overtime is as well, so you know how hard your staff are working. Maybe they've got a different overtime rate or something like that you can handle in reporting. And now that they've changed timesheet grid, we can hook into that and change that. So they go in there, as the timesheet loads, we can go to the resource PSI. Using the resource sink that we've got in, we've put their contracted hours into as a custom resource field. We then interact with what they call the JS grid control and the status bar, so that we can then change how that looks and stops people from submitting time until they've done at least their contracted hours. We could even stop them from, we could have a separate thing for overtime, so that we can stop them from putting kind of anything over their contracted hours in kind of actual work, and a separate thing for overtime. I know that diagram wasn't particularly descriptive, so let's have a look at that in more detail. So, from a resource sink point of view, we've synced in that this user here has contracted hours. And this is actually for the client ARM who is speaking across the way. This user does 37.5 hours. This is us interacting, and you'll see that a user will be able to save, but they can't send their timesheet updates. And we've changed the status bar to say we're in progress, but error, you haven't entered your contracted hours yet. You've still got 37.5 hours to go. As people start entering in their time, we can say, oh, well, they've still got 7.5 hours left, so we can still save, which means it still gives them the process of, some people like to fill their timesheet, maybe it's a weekly timesheet, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Some people like to do it at the end of the week. It still gives them that flexibility, but they can't submit it and trouble the project manager for approval, or the resource manager, until they've done at least their contracted hours. And it just helps guide that process to stop the pain. Because no one really likes doing timesheets. But they're kind of a necessary evil. But of course, once they've done it, we can then bring that through, and we can then enable the button, and we can then allow them to send it off. It's not perfect. Obviously, someone could put 37.5 hours on a Monday. But because we can hook into the JS grid, we could stop them from doing that. We can actually say on a Monday, the maximum number of hours they could do in the actual line is 7.5, if they wish. Obviously, you need to work out the logic of that. That's a good idea. Keeping it as simple as possible, but meeting your goal will be the path of least resistance, yeah? Trust me. So, in terms of look and feel, I mentioned very briefly, if we go back to the first way of implementing our deployment approaches, you can't actually connect SharePoint Designer, so you could have a gorgeous intranet on your SharePoint site collection or site collections, where they've customized the master page, and they've got lots of HTML5 wizardry and jQuery and other techie fanciness. Because as soon as they go into PWA, well, that looks like SharePoint. What a pain. Can't do too much about that yet. We'll go into that in a sec. At least, and we're trying to get a consistent look and feel here, yeah? So that when you're training someone on your user interface in SharePoint, there at least is some chance that they'll be able to cross-reference what you train them on in SharePoint on Project Server. You've got a better shot if you start going down the number 2 approach, but of course, as gentlemen in the audience said, you still want to get to PWA at some point. So if you've taken all your project sites out and put them under the SharePoint site collection, you can still inherit the look and feel of your SharePoint site collection and have that nice, rich UI that you've created. But then as soon as they go into Project Center, it still looks like SharePoint. And of course, with centralized lists, you still have the same problem. What can we do about that? With a little bit of code, a tiny, tiny bit of code, you can essentially inject CSS and jQuery files into the master page in a supported manner on all of these approaches. And we're talking like 5 lines of code. And essentially what it does is that in the master page, there are placeholders where you can inject values in. And we're essentially injecting the values of where to go and get the CSS and jQuery files. And once that's in there, and if you put those jQuery files and CSS files in the SharePoint site collection, you can now connect into SharePoint Designer, and you can change it, and you can change the look and feel. And you haven't opened the master page once in PWA, which keeps you in a still supported situation. Part of this presentation was about the enterprise features. Now, they've been doing BI in the SharePoint world outside of the pivot tables that you get in Project Server 2007, 2003 for a long time. You've got Excel services, but of course you need to have a good data source, yeah? And that's partly where SharePoint starts to fail. You need to have some kind of system to connect to. Project Server's got it out of the box. A reporting database, every time you publish a plan, the data goes from one place to the next and into the reporting database, and it's in a nice, reportable format for resources, for timesheets, for tasks, for projects. Which means that you can use standard BI features like the chart web part, you can connect that to your cube. You can use the reporting services database, that will go to your cube or the database directly. Excel services, Power Pivot, Visio, Performance Point. It's all there. There are loads of tutorials on MSDN to tell you how to use those BI features. So if we have a look at some of the examples of that, and I'll point you to this white paper from a guy called Andrew Lewinsky, who's here today on the UMT stand. This is something we have done for ARM. We go into the reporting database, and we can see that Phil Stanbury-Jones here. We can do those kind of standard graphs that you would get in, say, Project Server 2007 in reporting services, and we can bring that through. But using the kind of the filter mechanism that we're talking about in the centralized list idea, we can then do some fancy HTML at the top. We can change start dates and end dates, and you start to get that rich UI that hopefully you feel you may have lost by going from 2007 to 2010. But now you're on a more supported kind of BI platform in terms of the roadmap as far as Microsoft is concerned. And as they introduce new features, so SQL Server 2012 came out last week officially in RTM, they bring out new SharePoint reporting services databases, web parts, and they actually do nice things in terms of that reporting services web part. You don't have to upgrade to 2012 to get the benefit of it. It will connect to your 2008 R2 databases as well. But it's been rewritten from the ground up, and it's more performant. It's less buggy as well. More reporting service kind of details there. You can have multiple web parts on the page as well. Another example, another reporting services web part. Resource forecast utilization, another common view that you wanted to get, but of course, you're doing these reports yourself, and you can get it exactly how you want, exactly how your management expect to see it, exactly how your project management expect to see it as well. Using the jQuery method we talked about, and this works really well with the centralized list as well. You can put your rags in there and things like that. You can set something to red. You can turn that into something more visual using jQuery. And now that they've implemented Form Server, and you have that available as your enterprise features, and as part of 2010, you can use InfoPath Form Services to attach custom forms to your lists as well as kind of your form libraries. Your risk list can be as custom as you need it to be. It's no longer just the columns in the order that you are provided out the box. You can change things around, but it's still just 2 columns. You can make it more sensical to your user base, yeah? You can separate things out, so you've got the summary data, the assessment of the risk. You can put little question marks in there to give them a bit of a helping hand, to help that kind of training period so that you can really guide your users through the system. And then there's the analysis services cube. So in options 1 and 2, as long as you kind of stay in a kind of standard model, you will get soft data coming into the cube. Of course, with the reporting database, it's almost live data, yeah? But the analysis services cube is done on a schedule, which you typically do overnight when users aren't using the system, because it kind of slows down your system as well. But it's also made for performance. And it'll be very quick to bring this data in. And again, the standard kind of performance, the standard BI features like Excel services, performance point, Power Pivot, etc., can connect to this and bring the data through. Here's a good example of that. That's actually from this white paper. That's performance point, and you're going to bring in that data through. But of course, if you're using the analysis services cube, you don't have to work quite as hard because it's already pre-processed your measures and your dimensions. So you can literally just drag in years and time phases, and you can bring that through, and there's a nice dashboard designer for you to implement that as well. So you can literally drag things onto the page, save it up, and go, here you go, management. Here are your results. So we've talked about some of the key kind of enterprise features. Does anybody have any questions about that? No? Good. Project Server and SharePoint. I just want to talk about performance. So there's a lot more data and more data transition going around in Project Server compared to SharePoint. And that has a real effect on your system. So the specs that you would do for a SharePoint server are not the same that you would do for Project Server. There's a lot of high I/O. You've got, obviously, the project client, which is heavily interacting with your database, because you've still got those integration features that we haven't talked too much about, but in terms of your centralized resourcing, your centralized planning, all of that is still the same, and that is still out of the box. You're still getting your centralized resources, but really heavy, really, really heavy. And to get that check-in and check-out functionality like you might get in kind of documents and drafts and published versions, they actually have 3 databases. They start with a draft database, so when you press save in your client, it takes all the changes that you've made and puts that up. And if you're doing like a massive plan, maybe you've imported something from an old version, it's like 1,000 lines or something like that, every single one of those lines go up, times that by the number of resources, times that by the number of days, and you're talking about tens of thousands of rows going up between the client and the server to the draft database. Way, way more intense, and yet all the project manager has done is copied and pasted something from itself. If that sounds like an unlikely scenario, as you're going through from the draft database, and then obviously when it publishes it, it takes a copy of it, then it has to process it for reporting. If we add timesheeting into the mix, maybe you do weekly timesheets, and let's check the time here. Okay. Yeah, so if you do weekly timesheets, you will have this idea of maybe all timesheets need to be done on a Friday so that they can be approved on a Monday, yeah? Well, that is going to cause a flurry of activity on certain days, which will be totally different from your SharePoint flurry of activity as well. So, we're doing single entry mode. We're applying actuals based on approvals of your timesheets. They're entered on a weekly basis. In order for those timesheets to make sense, the plans need to be published and up to date on a Thursday. Then there's a whole load of timesheet data entry going in on a Friday. Someone might not be around. They've got to do it on a Monday or a Tuesday later. And then on the Monday, they then got to go through the approval and then republish the plan again. Project managers will get upset because all their stuff is really live and really visible. That's an expectation that you'll need to set because you're using a centralized system. Your graph will look a bit like that. So we're talking about, this is a system here where there's actually only 700 users that could possibly use the system because we're just in phase 1 at the moment. However, if we look towards the end of the week, we're getting to really heavy, high usages, which is not the kind of thing you normally expect in a SharePoint environment, because you normally say 700 users, we're talking concurrent, maybe 70 users. You probably wouldn't get too much more than that. You might double it, maybe. But here we're hitting kind of the 400s and the 500s. And that's on a Friday. Nice dip on the weekend, because not many people work on a weekend, but at least 50 in this case do, it would appear. This is actually taken fairly recently, so like a few weeks ago. Then straight on to Monday, and we start to have a dip again, and we start to go up on the Thursday, everyone's publishing the plan, checking all the data is, and we keep going like that. It has a high impact on your resources, and you need to make sure that your servers are up to the job. So, to combat that, there's been a number of sessions here that I've certainly been to that talk about virtual versus physical hardware and things like that. As a company, we generally recommend physical. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use virtual. You can, it's supported, Hyper-V, VMware, certain versions of it. But if you're using virtualization, the whole point of virtualization, the reason why you probably invest in virtualization is because you can share resources, more servers on the same architecture, yeah? But on a system that's intense like this, where the demand for those resources will happen and they need it now, virtualization, at least out the box, requires you to step. The system will ask for some resources. I need more CPU time, I need more RAM. And VMware or Hyper-V will go, okay, you can have this much. Request more if you want more. Project server goes, yeah, I want more. And it keeps going, and it keeps going, until it eventually gets up to speed. But of course, the project manager has pressed save. And in the corner of the project client, it's still stayed at 0%. Why? What the hell's going on in my system? Oh my God. And it eventually gets there because it'll then go 0%, 20%, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100. Of course, in a timesheet scenario, single entry mode, you've now got all your users trying to do it on a Thursday. And then you've got your users trying to do it again on a Friday. And then you've got the approvals again on a Monday. You can combat that on virtualization. You can just say, don't step it. I want you to just dedicate the resources. And you might choose virtualization because it provides other things, something like vMotion that brings it from one server to the next and gives you that redundancy. But yeah, don't allow for the stepping. It becomes a real problem. And then you also need to make sure that you have the bandwidth when you're connected to SANs for your redundancy to make sure that the speed of those IOs that it's saving all that data to is nice and quick. Because people expect things in this digital world where things just go like that. But in a project server world where you're saving tens of thousands of rows every time you just go save, that expectation needs to be met with the appropriate resource in terms of your hardware, and also the expectation that it won't be as instantaneous as, say, saving a document in Word. Even though from a project client, they're still pressing save. Yes, sir?
Have you seen this problem specifically with the server or with SQL?
Excellent question. Excellent question. It is generally SQL, to be fair. But the web services that project connects to are on the web front end or on your application servers. So actually you see the problem twice. Does that answer your question?
Well, the reason for asking is we've got a current issue on this, and I'm being told that there's blocking going on
Okay.
in SQL. And whether it's SQL or the server, I don't know which, but there's some blocking going on, which results in my acceptance of all the updates from timesheets.
Yep.
I get a lot of red errors.
Right.
And
Okay.
You explain what they are. You said you got errors.
Are you on a virtualized environment or a physical?
I don't know.
You don't know. Okay. There could be a number of factors that would contribute to that. How mature is your implementation? Do you have lots of BI going into the reporting database, or no? It's just generally out of the box. Okay. It could be this problem. It could be that the SQL Server is out of resources. It could be that it's on a shared farm with SharePoint, and therefore there's contention ratios between the different services, which essentially kind of does the same thing. It sounds more like the timesheet cube is not getting enough resource from the CPU. If you want to come and see me offline, we can talk about it a bit.
Giles, the default setting is 4 threads, so you need 3 threads.
That is correct, yeah.
It's been examined.
You've got to be careful setting the number of threads, remember. You don't want to overload your SQL server. So remember those 4 threads are per application server in your farm. Remember, a SQL server can handle so many threads at the same time with the same database set. So be very, very careful of that. It's 4 for a reason to start with. If you know what SQL server can handle, don't increase that, else you'll get deadlocks. And then you will have real issues.
I saw that there was a question down here. If we can leave it to the end, I'm starting to run out of time. I hope that's okay. So, this is well documented. And the planning capacity guides do get updated on a regular basis as Microsoft learn more about the implementations, the partners feed back this data. Definitely read this data. It will talk to you about that. It does talk about virtualization. Tends to be more on a Hyper-V point of view rather than the VMware. We've run some webcasts on VMware as well. I can point you to that direct after the show as well. So, breaking the rules. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Right. As a SharePoint consultant, I moved into a project server world, and there's this user profile service, or you brought users in via AD. Not true in project server. Totally got me at first. I didn't understand it until I really kind of moved into it, because I wasn't really into a project server world at the time. Separate service for the resource pool, which is keyed off the display name, not the user ID. Bit strange, but okay. You still link Active Directory users to that resource, but in 2010, before the June update, and this is a very specific scenario I can talk about after the show, but the AD username didn't have to be real, but after the June update, they then forced and validated AD. Forms-based authentication, claims-based authentication, you have to be wary because not all features are supported. Now, so project is now more part of SharePoint, the BI tools, you have to follow the guidance based on each separate component of SharePoint and project server to know what is supported by what authentication mechanism. You're generally safe with AD, Kerberos authentication. Permission model, like I said before, is completely different. It's a lot more advanced in project server because it needs to be. You might want people to be able to open the project in the client, whereas others can't. SharePoint doesn't have that concept, and nor should it. But it does mean that your SharePoint sites, especially in an option-free model, the permissions will be completely different. Certain special groups in your kind of option 1 and 2 sites, there are special groups, security groups that are synced, which means that if you add a user into your resource pool, into your build team, they automatically get resourced as you save and publish the plan. The owner of the site is always the project manager or the project owner of the plan. But it's all done on a timer job, and it does do that synchronization every time you publish, which means it doesn't handle the deltas, it doesn't handle the changes of the resources, so it actually clears out all the users, and then it re-adds them in. And if you're experienced in the project server queue, sometimes it blocks, and then no one can access the site. Republish the plan, it will work itself out. Compatibility of your browser is slightly different. There was a big marketing message when SharePoint 2010 came out that we support Firefox as well as IE. Excellent message. Not true in Project Web App. When it first came out, it was IE7, IE8 only. When IE9 came out, it wasn't supported until Service Pack 1. And then only certain features of PWA are supported, in particular, the things to do with team members. So my reminders, my written issues, and your timesheet entry. Project Center, though, forget it. This includes, because there are web parts and they are going down a more standard kind of SharePoint route. So if you take them out of PWA, because some of those controls about whether you can see it's actually in the master page and not on the web part itself. But if you actually take them out, you won't get warned, they just won't work if you put them into a separate site collection. And of course, as I've said several times before, you can't use SharePoint Designer in Project Web App to customize it. But you can use that feature. And you can come to me and I can help you with that. And then if you need to do kind of changes in kind of your previous sites, you can do all that by adding code. So, in conclusion, none of the approaches that I've talked about are wrong or right. Yeah? It's all about the maturity of your project management, kind of processes. It's all about the maturity of your use of the technology. Don't go in head first and implement the technology and go, how are we going to use it? Plan first. Decide, make a decision, even if it's really hard questions. Answer the hard questions before you do it and you won't go wrong. Out of the box is okay. It's fine. And is, in fact, a very easy approach. It's only when you want to get more from your platform that you would start to go through the other approaches. but I would start off simple because implementing Project Server is not really about the technology. It's the tool to aid your process. So I'm up here as a techie, but it makes total sense. You must sort out what you're trying to achieve before you then implement the tools to support it. I know it's been a semi kind of technical session. I know we haven't gone into code. Unfortunately, my client is actually running a business version of this session in terms of the option-free approach that's happening right now. Bad scheduling, I'm afraid. But it will be available after the conference, so you can download. I believe they're recording these sessions. If you want to see what option-free kind of looks like, how it looks and feels, I urge you to go and follow on PC301 on Twitter, or download them, or come back to me and I can point you in the right direction. Again, as I've said, each approach is valid and it really depends on the maturity. And the key thing I have found, hopefully, has came out as part of the BI side of things, reporting is the key to your success. Project is great, it's a data entry tool. You can bring all that data in. There's no point doing all this data entry and planning if you can't visualize it in a way that makes sense to all the stakeholders in your organization. Managers and executives will want to see a high-level kind of rolled-up view of things, whereas team members like myself that might be working on something, I want to see the detail. The reason why they've done this, so that they can have more rich BI, is so that you can achieve that in a more standard way. Use it. It's really good. And then all the links that I've talked about all the way through, they are there. That kind of reaches the end of my session. I urge you to fill out evaluations. Hopefully you've learned a lot. And if you need to contact me, those are my details. Thank you.